So I'm Mitch Paine. I am a program manager for King County in Washington. And what I want to talk about today is the work that King County is doing on equity and social justice, and particularly our focus on managing floodplains in a more equitable way. So floodplain management in King County is done by the River and Floodplain Management section, and we're a service provider to the King County Flood Control District. And there's a variety of things that our group does, from build and maintain levees and revetments, to floodplain mapping, to managing what we already have. We have a robust flood warning program. There's a whole bunch of other things that we do in partnership with other county agencies. And so our ability to manage and deal with our floodplains is very broad. And, you know, we have a little over 2.2 million people in King County, and we have 6 major river systems, from the Big Snoqualmie River in the kind of north central part of the county to a whole wide range of coastal hazards along our incorporated and unincorporated shoreline, as you see there. We've got about 120 miles of levees and revetments. And throughout the course of all of our river systems, we have 2 federally protected salmon species. And it kind of sets the stage for what we deal with and what we manage in King County. So back in 2008, our county executive signed an equity and social justice initiative that really set in motion work around equity and social justice. And the point of all of this is that equity and social justice is really embedded, and it's supposed to be embedded in programs, embedded in employee engagement, and embedded in all of the work that we do out in the community. And the goal of the Equity and Social Justice Initiative is to focus on investing upstream, so we solve the main problems in inequality, and we don't just deal with the consequences at the very downstream end. So the Equity and Social Justice Strategic Plan guides our initiatives, and what we assume per this Equity and Social Justice Strategic Plan is the fact that inequities that exist are not random. They are caused by decisions that were made by the county, by the state, by the national government, and embedded within those decisions and the way the world works today are systems of power and privilege. And as we perpetuate those systems, we inherently don't make inequality better. So what the strategic plan gets at is we lean into those problems. We look very closely at what they are and try to solve the structural problems. Because all of these structural problems that exist are really identified and can be identified by race, what the strategic plan does is say, let's lean into that and focus all of our work around race as the center point of the Equity and Social Justice Plan. So that's really what we look at and what we focus on. And then at the end of the day, you know, what we mean in terms of equity is a system of fairness and a system whereby everybody has access to power and everybody has the resources they need to achieve whatever their full potential is and to thrive in society. So that's what we look for when we implement our Equity and Social Justice Plan. So we look at these different streams that affect equity and social justice. And at the very end, if you see on the upper unhealthy stream, the things that we see in our community are high rates of homelessness, health problems that are disparate between different populations, things like unemployment at a higher rate in communities of color than in white communities. And those are the downstream issues. Those are the things that if we just address that, we're not addressing the true structural inequality. So we look further up the chain. We look at the fact that we have dilapidated housing, and when you have that, it causes health problems. And if your housing has to close, it might mean that you might lose your job and become more unemployed or underemployed. So when we look at dealing with social justice and trying to find the solutions, we look upstream, and we want to solve the real problems, not solve the symptoms of the problem. So when we transition to thinking about flooding, at the end of the day, what flooding does is cause long-term damage to someone's house or property or things that they own. And what that does is it reduces wealth. So one of the aspects of social justice that we look at is the transfer of wealth between generations. So when my family builds wealth over time by saving, by getting an education and earning more, they inevitably pass that wealth down to me, and I use that to build my own wealth. But if that wealth is taken away by either a lack of access to it or it's simply wiped out, I don't have that ability to translate and send that wealth down to my future generations. And that's what flooding does to families. When people don't have flood insurance and they lose their house and have to pay for it out of their savings, that reduces their wealth. That reduces their ability to send their kids to college in the future, reduces their ability to transfer that wealth to the next generation. And that's why we really need to care about this. This is kind of the Venn diagram of flooding and equity and social justice issues. The other thing about flooding that aligns with equity and social justice is the fact that it lasts for many days. You might be displaced from a house for a long time, and for some of us that may be easier than others to deal with. In my job, if I'm not able to be at home for many days, I have some ability to be flexible with my schedule. But if I'm a service worker at McDonald's or some other fast food restaurant, I can't just take a bunch of days off to deal with whatever flooding situations happens. And that affects people in different ways, and typically affects people at the lower end of the economic spectrum much more than those at the top. Flooding, of course, poses health risks, and the people that are more unable to deal with those health risks, either because they don't have health insurance or can't afford to deal with them, flooding is going to impact to a much greater degree than those who don't. Flooding is also a complicated hazard. It's complicated to understand the dynamics and flood risks, and it's also complicated and bureaucratic to deal with. And some people have a better ability to do that. Certainly if you don't speak English or don't have a lot of knowledge about any of this, flooding is not going to be something that you can just come to say, oh, okay, here's exactly what I need to do to my house to be safe. So it just the potential for flooding affects people differently as well. We in general have a bias to ignore it. It's not something that happens very often, and it's kind of a hard thing to understand, so we just kind of push it off. And we need to look at that when we try to deal with the human aspect of flooding. As I mentioned before, the flooding sets up in all of our flood systems and flood recovery systems, it's a big bureaucracy. It's knowing where to go to get access to the resources. It's knowing who to ask, what questions to ask. And not everybody has that knowledge or the ability to figure that kind of stuff out. And we need to look at that when we're thinking about equity and social justice. And certainly a lot of people have misconceptions between insurance coverage and disaster relief money that's available. And often that affects how people deal with flooding as a result. So to really get to the question of how we deal with equity and social justice and flooding, we really need to ask the question, who lives in the floodplain? It's difficult for us to plan and do anything about unless we know the answer to that question. And most of us think we do, but we really, really don't. There may be thousands and thousands of people that live in our floodplains, but we can't hope to know all of those people no matter how long we've been doing this work. So we have to look at data, and we have to try to figure out how we answer that question in a really clear and concise way. So what I want to talk about for the rest of this presentation is really about how we went about answering that question and looking specifically at the data, methods, and methodology that we use and some of the limitations of it. I really hope that this presentation can be used by other communities to try to figure out how they can answer this question and to be aware of some pitfalls in using more available data. So I want to dive deep into those concepts as we move forward. So the data that we really have to help us answer the question of who lives in floodplains is census data. And there's two aspects to census data. One is the decadal census that happens every 10 years that's going on soon, and that counts every single person in the United States. That is the goal of the census. And they send a questionnaire to every household in the country. But that census data is limited to just a few questions. They ask about, in addition to demographics, they ask about some basic questions about housing and households and household structure, and that's it. The real interesting information about language spoken at home, income, value of a home, commute time, all that other stuff, that's actually found in what's called the American Community Survey, which is a statistical sample of households that's conducted every year, every other year, and every 5 years. And it does not count everybody. It only counts a statistical sample. And while that's great, that becomes a problem when we try to drill in to a geographically small area so that we can try to say what's in the floodplain or who's in the floodplain and who's not. And that is the issue with dealing with census data. So as we look at how the geography of census data is organized, when we dig down into the counties or other county level jurisdictions in the country, the counties are made up of census tracts. And within the census tracts, you have block groups. Within those block groups are individual census blocks. That's the smallest geography of census data that's available. The problem with that is the only data that's available at the block level is the decadal census, just those basic questions that were asked here in the first part. The other information, the American Community Survey, is only available at the block group and census tract level, does not get down to the block level because it's a statistical sample. So all we have at the very narrowest census geography is a few basic points of information about people and households that are within that block. And that becomes important when we try to overlay the floodplain on it. So if all of the information that we really would love to use is available at the census tract level. This is an example of one of the equity social justice tools that King County uses for planning, but it's only available at the census tract level. So what we're seeing here is within each of these tracts, the darker blue is a higher percentage of people of color in these census tracts. So if we want to use this information to help us answer the question, who lives in floodplains? Well, naturally, we'd overlay the floodplain layer. But as that becomes very clear, none of the floodplain layer intersects very well with this tract layer. And so we can't make a clear case whether one tract is in the floodplain or outside of the floodplain, and we can't drill any deeper than these broad census tract levels. So this becomes a problem for using census tracts as our geography to answer the question, who lives in floodplains versus who doesn't. So to take a little closer look, this is a community that is east of Seattle, and Snoqualmie is almost entirely in the floodplain. So when we're trying to look and trying to answer the question here's how we can visualize the differences and the challenges of census geography. This is a census tract. There's about 2,400 people in the census tract. It's broken up into two block groups. So we're going to look at this westmost block group. And within this block group are 1,300 people. And then when we narrow it down to just one block, we're looking at just 13 people within that block. So if we overlay the floodplain on it, we can see that the floodplain doesn't cover the entire census tract. So it makes it hard to tell who within that tract lives in the floodplain or not. And then if we look at the block group level, it similarly is kind of cut in half by the floodplain, and even the block itself is cut in half. So it makes it really hard because these geographies are agglomerated numbers, makes it hard to be able to say who's in and who's out. And then if we drill down even deeper, in this block itself, it looks like half of it is covered by the floodplain, but actually the households, when we look at the aerial, are all outside of the floodplain. So everybody in this block group lives outside of the floodplain. And so that makes it hard for us to use this data, but it's the best data we have. So what we tried to do is incorporate some other data that's available in King County to try to better address the geographic issues and try to get at the data in a way that we can use for our planning purposes. So if we bring in the other data that we have, that a lot of communities have, and this is not unique to King County. So we bring in the parcel data from our assessor. We have address points that are used to determine emergency services, and typically those address points are geographically located in GIS on a building, although that's not perfect. So we can use that data to try to get some of this census data a little bit closer. Then we also brought in the building footprints. Microsoft recently, in the past couple of years, made a national building footprint layer available to everybody. So we use that layer, and then some of our individual cities have their own building footprint layers. So we brought in whatever we could, whatever building footprint information we could, kind of cross-check that to make sure that it was, sound data. And so the way we decided to do this, and the way we decided to get over the fact that a lot of our census blocks are not drawn in a way that lets us do this analysis easily, what we do is we assign all of the characteristics of people within this block, outlined in green, to each of the individual structures within that block. And then so every house then has the census block characteristics sort of as percentages. And then we go back out to the countywide scale, run our analysis of which buildings and which parcels are in the floodplain, and then we agglomerate all that data. It's kind of been averaged by block. The block data has been averaged to each building, and then we can use all of that data all together to give us a little bit better understanding and to refine that census data a little bit deeper. So let's look at this specific block itself. When we take the entire block statistics, what we have are 22 living units, 11 are owned with a mortgage, 6 are owned free and clear, and 5 are renter occupied. We have 46 people, 42 are white, 2 black, and 2 identify as 2 or more races. This is all from the census information that we have there. And so they're all single family residences. And if we look back at this image, the 13 of the houses here are in the floodplain. So what we do is we say, all right, 13 of the 22 houses are in the floodplain, so 59%. So we take 59% of 13, and so we assume 6.5 are owned with a mortgage, 3.5 are owned free and clear, and 3 are renter occupied. And then we apply those same characteristics to the demographic data. And when we do that for all of the structures in floodplains in King County, then we can start putting together some data that is meaningful and gets us to a little bit clearer picture of who lives in the floodplain. Now, part of the problem is not all areas have census blocks that are drawn well or make that much sense. And so this is one example of where we had to drill a little bit deeper and figure out what's going on with this. So you can see here, each of the green outlines is a census block. You can see some random ones with a 0 kind of in the middle upper left part of the screen that don't even have any buildings in them and are just labeled as 0. These are housing units. The numbers refer to how many housing units within each block there are. And right next to those zeros is one that looks like it has 3 apartment buildings and somehow 220 housing units within that block. And right to the east of it is a giant area with multiple different buildings, but it only has 12 housing units listed. So something's going on there. Right below that is a little tiny tendril of one that says 83 units are in an area that's geographically impossible. So what we had to do is drill into this data even closer and make sure that we actually apportioned these blocks appropriately. We can't do anything about the way the census drew these blocks, so we just have to use what we have and apply that. So what we did in areas like this is try to bring those blocks together, merge them in a way that we think the data will line up, and then try to run our analysis that way. We were worried that this would kind of throw our entire model out But what we found in doing a deeper analysis is that there's only a few places in the county where the blocks are drawn this badly. So we just deal with them kind of one-off, and we're able to get the data that we need. So what I want to show here is some preliminary results. We have not refined all the data, and we have not made it sort of final data. So this is all preliminary. But what this gets to is really interesting answers to our question of who lives in the floodplain. And it's been helpful for us to try to figure out how we can do and implement our programs a little bit differently. So what we found for all of the buildings using our approach in the floodplain, over 50% of all of the households are renters. And that's much different than just about 1/3 of the rest of King County who are renters. So a significantly higher percentage of the population of floodplains in King County are renters. And what that means is most of those renters probably don't have flood insurance. And that means all of their belongings that they have inside their structure are uninsured. We can also see a higher percentage comparatively of people who own their house free and clear. And people who own their house free and clear in a floodplain are not required to keep flood insurance. Flood insurance is only a requirement for a federally backed mortgage. And so the people in green are also less likely to have flood insurance. And in addition to their belongings, the house itself is at risk if they don't have flood insurance. So this gives us a lot of information about who might be actually more financially vulnerable to flooding. Also, renters are more likely to be people of color, and so we need to look at that a little bit closer too. And so as we match the tenure of the household by the identified race of the householder, we get even more interesting statistics here. This is a busy slide, but if we look a little bit closer at each of these different colors, each of these colors are a different racial group as designated by the census. The lighter colors are the owner-occupied percentage of those people in the floodplain, and the darker colors are renters. So if we look, say, at the red color, this represents people identified as African American, and what we can see is close to 85% of all of the people who identify as African Americans in the floodplain are renters. That's an even higher percentage that we saw for the county overall. Now, to be fair, the numbers for each of these people of color, groups of color, are fairly small numbers. They're not thousands. They're in the hundreds or the low thousands. But still, what this shows us is that, you know, the vast majority of all of the people of color in the floodplain are renters. And that means they're more likely to be financially vulnerable to the impacts from flooding. And that's something that we as a government can do something about, and we should. Similarly, the census asks about Hispanic identity a little bit differently. They don't treat it as a race necessarily. They treat it as an ethnicity, so they're asked separately. But for those people who identify as Hispanic or Latino, we see something similar, that almost 80% of all of the people who identify as Hispanic or Latino in the floodplain are renters, versus the people who don't identify. A little bit higher percentage of people who don't identify as Hispanic or Latino own their property in the floodplain. And again, this goes to show us that there are people that are much more financially vulnerable to flooding who identify as Hispanic or Latino. Overall, if we look at the racial dynamics, racial characteristics of the people who live in the floodplain, we see that a higher percentage of people in the floodplain identify as white than identify as people of color. And so that was a little bit of a surprising result. But of those people who identify as people of color, they are much more likely to be vulnerable to the impacts of flooding based on the characteristics of their home ownership tenure status. And that's kind of what we look at, and this is some of the things that we can use in our planning processes. We also did these results and averaged them out by the different watershed. And since not all of you are necessarily familiar with all of these watersheds. I'm going to skip over that, but we did do this part of the analysis too. So as we start looking at these preliminary results, the big conclusions we come to is that there's a much higher percentage of renters in the floodplain, and there are pretty big differences among the different demographic groups between all the watersheds. And each of the watersheds in King County has a different planning group and has a different collection of cities. And so we can do something by watershed in a different way here. And the vast majority of people who identify as Hispanic and Latino also rent. So what we can do with that is do better outreach. We can have more targeted information about flood insurance go to renters. We can use this information in our emergency operations to make sure we're getting at people who are renters, who might not be in a system. They might not, their addresses aren't necessarily in a system, and we need to do better about outreach to those groups and those populations. And this is what this information gets us to. And this is how we can start to make our reaction to flooding a bit more equitable and focus a little bit more on social justice. So, thinking back also to the data limitations, what we found in this process is that the census geography is really problematic. It's not easy for us to use. Every place in the country is a little bit differently, and so you really have to look into your own census data to see whether and how useful it is. And that's one of the lessons learned. And the other thing is, decadal census is available on the 2000, 2010, and 2020, and sometimes that gets outdated. 2010 was a whole different year in the Seattle metro area and probably doesn't really represent what's on the ground right now. So we're very eager to use the 2020 census data as quickly as we can to update some of these data points. So what our next steps are to write a report with these data, create graphics, and build it into what we call this equity impact review process. We'll use it as part of our implementation of our consistent organizations. We'll start to put some of this data and use some of this data in our comprehensive plan, as well as it's already been put into our regional hazard mitigation plan. And as we have a separate flood hazard management plan, and this information will be a key part of determining what we do in our flood hazard mitigation plan and how we plan our programs into the future. So we're very eager to use this information, and hope this is going to mean that we'll be able to deliver our services more equitably, and that we can try to address some of the structural problems that might be out there where people who are more vulnerable to flooding are in more dangerous places, and we can do something about that as our river and floodplain management section. So with that, thanks for listening, and if anyone has any questions about this or wants to dig in a little bit deeper into how we did this, feel free to contact me. My email's there and my phone number. I'd be happy to share more data with you. Thanks.